think I'm the last speaker on this. And Taoiseach, you've given a very fulsome address and a very fulsome apology, and that's to be welcomed. However, that apology will only be meaningful if it determines the next steps, if we're ahead. And number two, if it looks back as to how we are in this position. And so we're here today, and you talk about the institutions of the state let you down. They did a lot more than that. They actively contrived to prevent the truth coming out. They actively contrived against the families who are here today to get the truth. And the state institutions actively, if not actively, participated in a narrative that sought to defame those families. So it's a lot more than the institutions letting us down. And you pay tribute, and rightly so, to the three women who sat in the cold hut outside government buildings 15 years ago and who are here with us today, Gertrude Barrett, Antoinette Keegan and Bridget McDermott. But what you fail to say is the reason of why they were sitting out in the cold. And they were sitting out in the cold for something as basic as getting a copy of the Coffey report. And remember, the Coffey report came only after the government of the time set up a non-statutory inquiry, and the senior counsel Gallagher had to resign because he had already represented the Guards. So we're here today because of the absolute courage, determination of the families who are here and who can't be here today. And it's actually a humbling experience. And it must be very uncomfortable for the families to sit through all of this, but it should be a lot more uncomfortable for us, actually, because governments up to now, right up to when this apology has been absolutely extracted on the pain and the death and the sufferings, the addictions that followed, the suicides that followed, from the absolute appalling misuse of power. And that's what we're talking about here. And we're talking about the famous class divide in Ireland that's never spoken about. And quite clearly, that's what happened here. And a narrative was determined from day one because the powerful were in charge. And the powerful have remained in charge. And the narrative has remained until today. And now it has been lifted off. And you've had to stand here as Taoiseach and tell people they're innocent, what they knew from day one. But the powerful told them differently through the institutions of the state. And let's have a quick, brief look at how we got here. We go back to 1981 and that dreadful night. And the word tragedy is used, and it was certainly a tragedy, but it was also no justice from day one, absolutely none. So we start with the tragedy on the Valentine's Day into the next morning. And then we have a tribunal set up with Ronan Keane. And that report was in June, a 687-page report, which reported in 82. And actually, quite a lot of that report was damning against the owners and against various institutions, including the local authority. However, he came to a conclusion that was utterly not based on what he had said, and indeed some of his paragraphs contradict previous paragraphs. So anybody with the evidence that was before him that could come out and say probable arson, the serious problem here, and your job and our job is to look back and say, how in God's name did that happen? And so after outlining all of the faults that he found in relation to, he was critical of the executive directors, he was critical of the safety measures and so on. And he says, Mr. Butterley bears a responsibility for the practice of keeping the emergency exits secured with chains and padlocks. A recklessly dangerous practice which regularly endangered the lives of over 1,000 people and so on. They were the strong conclusions of Ronan Keane, who was a High Court judge at the time. And then he goes on to say probable arson. How could that happen? How could that happen? And then we go on forward, and what happens next? We have that actually tribunal was coexistent with the very faulty inquests that were held at the time for a few days that didn't look at the wider circumstances, but just gave us the medical cause of death. And then we go forward, and Mr. Butterley and his family, and we see that a compensation, he gets over £500,000 in 1985 for malicious damage. For malicious damage. And we have Mr. Justice Sean O'Hanrahan concluding that the Stardust fire was started maliciously, another judge backing up the narrative. And then we go forward to the Compensation Tribunal in 85, which was another insult to the families. And we have Mr. Justice Donald Barrington, a much respected judge, and we have all the applications. But there's no appeal from that except in relation to very specific law. And what's interesting about that is we're told that we can't compensate for mental upset. Can you imagine that? Imagine going through all of this to be told by a judge. And then we have John Keegan appealing that to the Supreme Court, and the narrative continues. And on the day that the Supreme Court refused his appeal on whatever narrow grounds he took, he dies on that day. And over along this period of 43 years, which I don't really have time to go into, but it's really important to remember this did not happen by accident. And we have Christy Moore's song, They Never Came Home. And as was mentioned before, he's held in contempt by Justice Frank Murphy, that the song was in contempt of court. He ruled that the lyrics of the song contained statements or comments calculated to prejudice a fair trial. But the comments by the establishment in relation to the people when they were telling lies according to the establishment, that wasn't prejudicing anything or looking down on anything. Here was the powerful protecting the powerful. We had a primetime programme in 2006. We had research on behalf of the families by Geraldine Foy, and named Nothing But the Truth and the Case for a New Public Inquiry. Of course, that didn't happen either. And then we have we have the Coffey report that I referred to, which was Bertie Ahern, and he announced an external independent examination. However, there was a conflict of interest, as I've pointed out, and then we come to Coffey. And it's already been mentioned that his report had to be revised, and he gave the option there of, if you don't take out probable arson, then there should be a full public inquiry. And what did the government do? Not sort of say something seriously around here, we need a public inquiry. They take out the words and they leave everything else intact. And then we go forward, and the public record, thanks be to God, is corrected finally on that. And we go forward to the McCartan report, 2017, and he had insult to injury. And that report came on top of Deputy Bruin, who did tremendous work. I want to pay tribute to him. And he was my introduction to the Stardust fire when I became a TD in 16. And what does the former judge tell us? He tells us a dossier representing the case for a new inquiry was delivered to this assessment. What does he tell us about that? It was rambling, argumentative, disorganised, and at times incoherent. It was only at the end on page 358 that there was any statement of what the new evidence was. Difficult to understand, right up to 17. And then we go forward to 19, and we have the very courageous solicitor and the Phoenix Law. And they go through the European Convention of Human Rights. And Seamus Wolfe finally sees sense and says there must be new. And that's taken us from 2019 till last week when we got unlawful deaths. Now listen to what that's saying, unlawful deaths. So there has to be some accountability here in relation to who is responsible for the unlawful deaths. There has to be something for the government that recognises that in every single report that I've seen in my limited time in the Dáil, there's a self-serving narrative. We had the mother and baby home, and the report was never given. It was held on the shelves for months, and when it was finally given, they were told to download it. And then a scheme was set up where everybody under 6 months was excluded. So that narrative that persisted from the mother and baby home report, where the evidence, just like with this Ronan Keane, should have led to a different conclusion. It led to a conclusion that the evidence from the ordinary people was contaminated. Not the social workers, not the priests, not the judges, contaminated. I'm going to finish on it. So there's a narrative here, the same narrative in relation to the Kerry Babies Tribunal that was set up to investigate the guards, and we get a narrative about Joanna Hayes and her family. And they've got an apology. The survivors of Stardust have got an apology. But the establishment has learned absolutely nothing, because the powerful protect the powerful. And what's happened here was absolutely class distinction. And if you don't face that and begin to learn from that, we have learned nothing. I'm indebted to the survivors for making me think, reflect, and indebted to your courage. Thank you.